Hello again. Welcome to the second video in the phonology unit. I think, if my calculations are right, we are about halfway through this course right now. So congrats on making it halfway. Today we're going to talk about allophones and complementary distribution, which are two technical sounding terms, but that are actually fairly simple. So if you remember, in phonetics, we talked about how sometimes sounds go through processes to create similar sounds, like when the T goes through some sort of aspiration to become T, or when you nasalize vowels, as in an. Well, we're going to revisit these sounds and the general idea behind these processes. We know that, for example, we nasalize sounds before nasal consonants. But what if we didn't? What if I said, instead of span, span, without the nasality? What if I released the T at the end of the word cat? So instead of cat, I said cat. Even though these sound different, they're more or less the same words, right? You could still likely tell what I was saying. But what if I replaced the last sound of the word span with and I said spam? Or in the word cat, if I replaced the last sound with a b and said cab? Well, in both of these cases, I still only changed one sound, but I changed the meaning. I created a new word by changing that one sound. So why is it that some sounds create new words while others don't? Well, this is essentially the question at the center of phonology as a study. In order to answer this sort of question, linguists have developed two terms: allophones and phonemes. Let's start with the second of these. A phoneme is the smallest unit of meaningful sound in a language. So what does it mean to be meaningful? And what is a meaningful sound? Well, for the purposes of this class, we can say that a sound is meaningful when it can be used to distinguish two words. Let's look again at our previous examples. Changing from a nasalized vowel to a non-nasalized vowel didn't seem to change the meaning. We went from span to span. It's still the same word. Changing the final consonant, though, of the word span to an M, spam, does change the meaning. Because this is a single instance of change, and there is a meaning change, we would say that N and M are different phonemes in English. It's worth noting that phonemes vary from language to language. Every language has its own set of phonemes, and this is one of the things that differentiate and define individual languages. When you can change a single sound and get a new word, as in span and spam, we have what is called a minimal pair. If you have a minimal pair, the two sounds that differ are always separate phonemes. So what does that make and Because the sounds are different, but they don't change the meaning when we use one instead of the other. Same with a non-aspirated T and an aspirated T. If I say pit versus pit, they're both the same word. They just sound a bit different. Well, these variants are what we would call allophones. Allophones can be defined as phonetic variations of a single phoneme. Put another way, phonemes are mental groupings of allophones. A phoneme is always spoken about with slashes because we are not talking about precise instances of the sound. Instead, when we talk about phonemes, we're talking about the way the mind organizes and groups sounds. We always use slashes when writing about phonemes. Allophones, on the other hand, are always written in brackets because we are referring to the specific instance of how they are pronounced. In English, all of our vowels have a nasal allophone. There is never an instance where the nasality of a vowel changes meaning. That's not necessarily the case, though, in languages like French, where the nasality of a vowel does change meaning. In English, when we talk about the high front unrounded tense vowel, E, we're talking about the mental grouping of E and Ng. Similarly to nasalization, English voiceless stops have multiple allophones. So if we take P, T, and K, or P, T, and K, again in slashes because we're talking about the mental units here, we have phonemes. Each of these phonemes have three variants. They have the aspirated versions, P, T, and K, as well as the unreleased versions, where we don't entirely release the stop in our mouth. So something like the sounds at the ends of cap, pat, and kick. And then finally we have the plain versions, which I'm going to say here, and they're going to sound actually like different sounds, but trust me, they're the plain versions of P, T, and K. So we've got B, D, and G. So we already know that each of these three variants for these unaspirated stops are allophones. Using an aspirated stop instead of an unreleased stop might sound a little bit odd, but it won't change the meaning of a word. But this is with English, and English is fairly well documented, and most of the people here speak it very well. So what about in languages where we don't speak the language, and we only have a little bit of data? How can we tell what's a phoneme versus what's an allophone in those languages? Well, we can use something called complementary distribution for this. Complementary distribution refers to a situation where two sounds never occur in the same context. This term seems to be a bit of a hang-up for a lot of students. So again, I'm going to go over this. Complementary, meaning two things complement each other, as in they don't share a context, and distribution, as in they occur in this way. So complementary distribution refers to two sounds that never occur in the same context. There's a very popular metaphor in linguistics. I've actually improved it, so you're going to get my version of it, which is inherently better. And that's the Superman metaphor. So let's say that you have an alien, and that alien's name is Kal-El. He was sent from his planet, Krypton, to Earth when it was destroyed. And on Earth, he finds out he has some superpowers, but he's raised as a human named Clark Kent. Later in life, he becomes a superhero and calls himself Superman. Well, if we were investigators and we were trying to figure out who Superman is, we might notice, well, we never see Clark Kent and Superman in the same room at the same time. And that might tell us that they're actually the same person, just in different costumes. In this metaphor, Kal-El would be the phoneme, and Clark Kent and Superman would be allophones of Kal-El. So let's use this topic in language. Let's try a fictional language that I've just made up. And I'm going to give you some data. This is presumably the entire language. There's nothing missing. So, we've got a series of words. We've got geen, cleam, deem, theg, se, tim, nis, and ik. Now, based on these data, can we determine whether the sounds e and e are allophones of the same phoneme, or whether or not they are separate phonemes? Well, how would we even begin to figure this out? First, we look to see if there are any minimal pairs between the two of them. If there are minimal pairs, that is to say, if there is an instance where the changing of only one of these sounds makes a meaning difference, then we know that they are phonemes. And we know this because they are not in complementary distribution. because they would be occurring in the same context. Here, context just refers to the sounds before and after the sound in question. So if, for example, we had a word dim and a word deem, E and I would be occurring in the same context because they both have d before and after. Unfortunately, that's not the case, so it's not quite as easy. Our next step is to then list all of the contexts that we see each of the sounds in. So, going through them one by one, we can see that E is found between G and N in geen, D and in deem, Ul and in cleam, and finally th and g in theg. Let's do the same thing for I. We have n and s in nis. We have the start of a word on the left and k on the right in ik. We have s to the left and the end of the word to the right in the word s. We have between t and in the word tim, and that's it. Do note that we're using the hash sign to identify a word boundary, and when it comes before an underscore, it means the word start, and when it comes after an underscore, it means word end. So let's try to generalize things a bit. Well, let's focus first on E. Let's look at everything before the sound. We've got g, l, d, and th. What do they have in common? Well, they're all consonants, so that's great. They don't seem to share a place of articulation because we've got velar, we've got lateral, we've got alveolar, and we've got dental. But they do all seem to be voiced. So that's actually good. Let's just, for now, mark them as consonants, the letter C, with a feature that says that they are voiced, as in plus voice. Okay, let's look at the after sounds of E. We've got n, and g. Well, they're all consonants. They don't really share a place, but they are all voiced stops. Although some are nasal and some are oral. But they are all stops. So let's just mark these as consonant C plus stop, plus voice. Okay, good. So we have a general context for E. We can say that E occurs between a consonant that is voiced and a consonant that is a voiced stop. And we will write it like this just to give us that. So the underscore basically means this is the context in which it occurs. Let's do the same thing for I. So everything before is s, t, n, and the start of a word. So here we have voiced and voiceless consonants, but then some things that aren't consonants, like a word start. There's not a whole lot we can generalize here. They don't all seem to occur in the same place. They might all be sort of alveolar-ish, except for the fact that there's a word start, so there's not a lot of generalization we can do here. If we look at everything after the sound, we've got a word end, we've got s, and k. Again, there's not a lot of shared features that we can generalize. There's not any absolute minimal pairs, but do we see any complementary distribution? Remember, complementary distribution is where two sounds never occur in the same context. The closest thing we have to a shared context between E and I is with I being between t and and E being between ul and They both share something that follows. But the things that precede, ul is a voiced liquid, while t is a voiceless stop. They're actually quite different. So we would say that these two sounds share no contexts, which means they are in complementary distribution because they share no contexts. As a result, we would say that they're allophones of the same phoneme. Okay, great. So E and I are allophones in this language. We know that they are variations of the same phoneme, and that something causes one to occur where another doesn't. Recall the Superman example. The thing that causes Superman to occur is danger. I'm not really sure that we can say danger is what causes E to occur versus I. But we can figure out what causes one sound to occur instead of the other. And we'll go through this, but we'll save that for the next video, as it's a bit more involved. One thing I would like to talk about, now that we're at the end of this video, is how we deal with phonemes as children. So, up until about the age of 6 months, children are able to distinguish all of the sounds that they hear. They are able to hear and process them as individual sounds. After about 6 months, though, children start to organize the sounds into the phonemes of their native language. That means that for an English speaker, after about 6 months, they don't hear the difference between an aspirated t and a non-aspirated d. To them, these are the same sounds under the same umbrella in their head. Of course, because different languages have different phonological inventories, in some languages, the distinction of aspiration is phonemic, and speakers of these languages recognize these sounds as different. You see something that's very commonly cited where some languages don't distinguish between l and r. Instead, they have sort of an intermediate r. And babies in those languages, before 6 months, could probably hear and process l and r as separate sounds. However, after about 6 months, they start to organize them under the same unit, and they start having a harder time distinguishing between them. Which means when they go to learn languages like English, where l and r are different phonemes, they have a bit of a harder time. Now, that said, learning the distinction between these sounds or between any allophones of a phoneme is something that can be done, but it is much harder after you're about 6 months old. So if you're ever speaking to someone and you notice they are having a hard time distinguishing between two sounds, for example, they always say something like vowel instead of vowel because in their language the difference between w and v is not as distinguished, don't hold it against them. Because one, holding something against somebody for the way that they speak is not great, but also because they actually do have a harder time hearing the difference, and you will have a harder time hearing the difference between two allophones. You just have to find the right language in which to be exposed to that. So with that, I will end this video, and I hope to see everybody in the next one. Thanks.